CNBC TV 18 Town Hall. I'm Shireen Bhan, and it is my pleasure to welcome here on the Town Hall investor, author and columnist Ruchir Sharma. Ruchir, great to have you on the program, and congratulations on your new book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism. Before I talk to Ruchir about his book and his hypotheses, I'd also like to welcome to the Town Hall a very eminent set of our participants who join us here for what promises to be an engaging, immersive experience. That's the idea of the Town Hall. It is CNBC TV 18's 25th year. We turned 25 this year. And the idea behind putting the Town Halls together was to curate meaningful conversations with people that matter, to put together opinions that will have an influence and shape policy. Welcome to the former Finance Secretary Subhash Garg. We've got the former NHAI Chairman Raghav Chandra, Gaurav Dalmia, Mr. Omkar Kanwar, Shubhrakant Panda, Prateek Jain, Rajiv Dimri, and a whole host of others here this evening. Thank you very much for joining us for this very special occasion. Well, Ruchir, let's talk about the book. And if I go back to your time in school, you've always been fascinated with capitalism and its impact on the world. So this has been a book in the making for 25 years plus now. But what has triggered the book, and also the lens with which you have looked at it, which is very different, because so far, especially post-2008, the discourse has been around what business has done wrong, how business has brought down the idea of capitalism. But your diagnosis is entirely different.
Yeah, I think to put this in context, I'd like to talk about two things. One, that I wrote my first book back in 2012, Breakout Nations. The basic thesis of that book, if you will recall, it was an economic travelogue of the world. And it was, at that point in time, I sort of felt that the BRICS were really overhyped. That was the basic thesis of that book.
And it turned out accurately.
Well, yeah, that's for you to say that. And the book ended on the note that the true breakout nation of the world is really America. So the last couple of chapters were dedicated to America, its technological prowess. I was always fascinated by how it's always able to come back. Because remember, when I wrote that book back in 2012, there was a lot of pessimism about America. It had just been downgraded by S&P, and there was a lot of pessimism as to why the economy is not growing faster and stuff. So that was the context in terms of my first book. And then after the last decade, it really ended up being America's decade from an economic and financial perspective. With the result today that we have this incredible disconnect where America today is about 25% of, or 26% of the global economic output in terms of global GDP. America is 26%. But if you look at the global stock market values, America, depending how you count it, is somewhere between 50 to 70%. It's nearly 70% if you look at the global MSCI indices. It is 50% just pure market cap basis. So huge disconnect between how America has done economically and how America has done financially. Economically, it's done reasonably well, but financially, it's a complete superpower. So the last decade played out that way. I wrote a foreign affairs essay in 2020 documenting how it's been the comeback nation. But at the same time, what started to bother me was that despite this incredible success that America has had over the last decade or so, the number of people within America who are disaffected with the way things are was reaching new record highs. So in fact, today, if you look at America, if you look at the various surveys, there are only 25 to 30% of Americans who believe their economy is moving in the right track. Their country is moving in the right direction.
Right.
There are about, most independents even, it's very polarized. Of course, Republicans currently hate the economy and everything about it. But it's very polarized that most even independents today in America feel that the entire economic system needs to be torn down and something new is needed. And then the one stat has always remained with me, for a while now, which is the fact that today, most young Americans, particularly if they're Democrats, say they would rather have socialism than capitalism. In terms of that, this is a very serious statement in some way that most young Americans, they think that they'd rather have socialism than capitalism.
So it was your personal scars of dealing with socialism way back through the 70s that has, in a way, been the trigger for you to put this book together.
Yeah, as you know, that we sort of grew up in the 70s and 80s India, one that was still very much in the socialist grip. The economy in India, as you know, was faced with shortages. We go back to all the times when, just getting a phone connection was such a big deal, and we just lived off one channel. So we saw what socialism was like. We saw what license Raj was like. We had that experience. And here it is that Americans today, young Americans in particular, are saying that they'd rather have socialism than capitalism. So that got me really thinking that what really went wrong with capitalism in a way. Basic thought of the book came through for me when we were all locked up during the pandemic, right? Which is that here we were, that we have the pandemic. Governments decide around the world that they're going to shut their economies down and shut everything down. And they think that there is no consequence to this because they can just stimulate. So the amount of stimulus that was put to work during the pandemic was incredible in terms of, it just surpassed anything else we had in the past. And I would dare say that governments were emboldened to shut their economies down because they thought that they could have the stimulus. In the past, when we had pandemics, you had to deal with it, or because shutting businesses down arbitrarily or telling everyone to sit home was not an option because people didn't think that way. Governments didn't think that they had the option of being able to stimulate.
Yeah.
This time they thought that they could do monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, they could do credit guarantees, they could bail anyone else out in trouble. And I was aghast to see what was happening in 2020, where the stimulus was such and the way that the governments were intervening was such where at some point in time the Fed and the Treasury, they were buying corporate paper associated with Warren Buffett's companies, so they were buying AAA credit sitting there and just doling out this incredible stimulus and being told, and most of that stimulus, as happened, flew to the rich. So I think that's what really got me thinking.
So again, just on that, and I'm interrupting you here. So the idea is not that you're saying there should be no safety nets, but you're saying that the way that safety nets are today operating are not for the people that they were meant to operate for to start with. And that's the example that you've just given us through the course of the pandemic. So the idea is not to do away with the safety nets, but it's reprioritization.
Yes, but as I again argue in the book, that if you look at the history of capitalism, in the first 200 years or so, if you take America, right up until the 1920s, government spending as a share of the economy was pretty stable at about 3%. The idea of the government back then was that the government will deliver your mail and it will take care of defense, literally. Nearly half the employees, I think, in the government then were employed by the post office, right? So that is what the concept of government was until the 1920s. Then you have the Great Depression, which takes place. And the idea of having this laissez-faire capitalism without any safety net, without any stuff, is exposed. And once that, that happens, then the role of government begins to steadily increase. Now, you can argue that was a very extreme, ruthless, Dixonian form of capitalism that existed, and there's no going back to that. But from then onwards, it's been a steady march. And the government is not just about safety nets anymore. It's about bailouts. It's about regulation. It's about micromanaging the business cycle. It's about rescuing anyone who is seen to be in trouble.
You give a nice example of what America is going through as far as its pain management mentality is concerned, and that's how the markets are now starting to operate, that every time something goes wrong, even if it doesn't have a systemic impact, the government intervenes and steps in.
So the example that you're talking about is one of my favorite analogies in the book, which is the fact that in America they have an opiate crisis, where, and the reason why they have this opiate crisis is, as many medical people have said, is that the slightest hint of any pain, you administer opiates. So you become hooked then, on opiates in terms of that. And you have so many people, you have so many movies, everything else which have been made documenting that. So the same approach now has come to economic management, which is that at the slightest hint of trouble, you administer stimulus or you do like a rescue. It's no longer very selective. Even in America, and this is what I find it really fascinating, the concept of bailing out private sector companies was considered completely heretical until the 1980s. So before that, the private sector was supposed to operate on its own and the government was not supposed to come to the rescue if any companies got in trouble. In the 1970s, we got the first calls for such bailouts, and it was met with a lot of opposition, including from politicians. Then, and this is the irony of it, that in the middle of the so-called Reagan-Thatcher revolution, which we thought was all about free markets doing well, In 1984, the first big bailout of an American financial institution takes place. That's Continental Illinois. And after that, there's been no looking back, which is that one after another, every time there's been a crisis, whether the savings and loans crisis in the late 1980s, then LTCM, which happened in 1998, and then you had in 2008, of course, all the bailouts, and then the pandemic, and then last year in 2023, you have Silicon Valley Bank, like a bank of rich depositors, and that sort of runs into trouble. And then once again, the government there decides that it needs to bail out, so the depositors don't take any haircut, and like they're bailed out. And like, who's getting bailed out here? And this has many negative consequences. This is all about some abstract modern hazard concept. No, there are two very tangible negative
deficits and debt.
No, I'd say this is like a bit different, because like often when the government bails out, it's not even using any money. It's just sort of saying that we are here to backstop it. Now you argue, what's the price of this? Because, like debt and deficits, there's a clear price. Well, there are two prices here. One, that the average person really feels very miffed about this. That these big guys are getting bailed out, in terms of that. And here, even in 2008, small community banks went bust and stuff. Yet the big financial institutions got bailed out. So there's a lot of resentment that
Which is what gives capitalism its bad name.
Exactly. Okay, who is this for? Who's capitalism for? Why are these big fat cats getting bailed out in terms of it? Or like these rich deposits getting bailed out? And the second thing, which I think is something I've spent a lot of time in the book, is that the ultimate paradox, that why is productivity growth in the Western world, in America included, declining? That we are in the midst of this incredible tech boom, which is taking place, and yet productivity growth, which is the key to economic growth. Remember, the key to economic growth is productivity growth. Why is this declining? And I think that once again here, like the sort of answer is that because of the fact that you have this dynamism has been lost, because you're bailing out companies, you're keeping alive so many deadwood companies.
Zombie companies.
Zombie companies. I mean, that's a great point that you brought up. Like one example out there that I have in the book is that, once again, that in the 1990s or so, this term zombie companies became a bit popular. Why? Because Japan, the economy and the markets were going bust, and the Japanese corporations and the Japanese government and all were keeping alive a lot of smaller companies which were very inefficient, rescued by easy money. So the term zombie companies became popular. The American media, as I document in the book, this is fascinating. Back in the 1990s and all, including the New York Times and all, which are sort of left-leaning liberal entities, they would mock the Japanese, saying that happens in Japan. America doesn't do this. That was the kind of attitude. At that point in time, the number of zombie companies in America as a share of the total was like 2% or something like that.
Today?
Fast forward today. Today, by some measures, including by institutions such as the Bank of International Settlements or so, nearly 20% of all companies in America can be classified as zombie companies. What are these companies? These are companies that are not able to earn enough to cover their interest and debt payments. So they have to keep going to the market every year. And for 3 years in a row, they've been doing that. And they get classified as zombie companies. So you have, like, in terms of to imagine that
20%.
That like in the heart of capitalism, this is what's happening. And in Europe, it's even worse in terms of, in places like UK and all, the number of zombie companies is even more. So in Western societies here, zombieism has now become, it's become a zombification of capitalism. That's what's taken place out here.
Socializing risks and zombification of capitalism. Those are nice headlines that you've given us, Richard. But what's the way forward? And we've got the American elections coming up. There doesn't seem to be much difference if you look at both sides in terms of government intervention or the role that the government should be playing as far as the economy is concerned. There is a lot of rhetoric, though, on taxes and whether there should be cuts or there should be hikes, depending on which side of the fence you're on. But what is the way forward? If there is no looking back and there is no going back, what do you believe is the way forward?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, as I said, that in terms of, and this is an experience that even we have learned, what made us turn our course, right?
A crisis.
Exactly. So that's really the unfortunate message, that unless and until you have an apparent crisis. Now, I think we already have an insidious crisis, which is the fact that productivity growth has been declining. There's so much disaffection with capitalism amongst the average voter, but there is no willpower which can be mustered to do something about this unless you have an apparent crisis. What does an apparent crisis look like? An apparent crisis is when the government literally runs out of money or the ability to carry on with these actions. And I think that we're getting close to that point. That,
Given where the debt levels are.
Exactly. So in terms of, if you look at the debt and deficit levels in America today, it's staggering that here you are in the middle of a relatively decent economic expansion, but at what cost is this coming? Today, America is running a budget deficit of nearly 6% of GDP. In the middle of an economic expansion, it's running this deficit. You know, like in the past, it would run about 3% or so.
Yeah.
Now it's decided it doesn't really matter. The world will keep putting money here. We have the world's reserve currency. We can keep borrowing. So 6% of GDP is fine. Can you imagine that if they have any downturn, that deficit will automatically, because revenues decline, spending goes up, will blow up to 8, 9, 10% of GDP. America's debt now as a share of its economy is behind that of only Japan and Italy. And by the end of this decade, on the current path, it would have overtaken Italy as well. So that's the path on which they are. And you correctly point out that neither of these candidates are paying any attention to this, because they think all this talk, is irrelevant, because America is such a dominant economy. It'll never ever default on its debt, and these are emerging market problems to deal with. So we can go ahead. But my fear is that the path we are on is a very dangerous path from a debt and deficits path. But the second thing, as I said, is that the crisis of capitalism is already here, which is that if you have most young people who are disaffected with the system, even if the economic growth rate looks good at the surface, what's the point? And I think that that's why you have a lot of populist anger, and whoever is able to feed into it without quite offering what the concrete message is, as we're seeing that therefore we find so many irrational actors capitalizing on that populist anger.